Today's webinar is number 15 in our series, and it's an introduction to accessibility by Stace Robertson from Arts Access Aotearoa. I will introduce Stace in a moment, but as usual, we'll start with a karakia. Whakatakati hau ki te uru, whakatakati hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Stace Robertson today. We're really thrilled that he's here speaking to us. So Stace is Inclusion and Participation Advisor for Arts Access Aotearoa. And he is the first port of call for arts venues, museums, organisations, festivals, practitioners wanting to become more accessible and inclusive in the arts. Today, he will be giving us an introduction to accessibility in the culture and heritage sector. This session will cover some things about why access is important, different types of access, engagement with deaf and disability communities, access during the time of COVID, and how Arts Access Aotearoa can support you and your organisation. So I won't take any more time. Stace, I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for having me today, and thank you, Helen, for the introduction. My name is Stace Robertson. My sign name is Stace, and it was gifted to me by a deaf friend and is based on the sign for tattoo because I have lots of tattoos. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. My ancestors are from Scotland, Ireland, France, and England. Today I'm wearing my wire-framed glasses. I've got big wooden earrings in my ears, and I'm wearing a pale green jumper with a spotted polka dot navy shirt underneath. I'm a disabled person. I'm an artist. I have a Bachelor of Media Arts with honours from Wintec in Hamilton, which is where I grew up. And I also have a background in community development. My role at Arts Access Aotearoa is Access and Inclusion and Participation Advisor, or Kaiarahi Atoi. And in my role, I support arts organisations to increase their accessibility for deaf and disabled people. So I'm very excited to talk with you about accessibility in the museum and culture education space. So Arts Access Aotearoa is a support, advocacy and information service, and our purpose is to reduce barriers to access in the arts for all people. We work nationally and we advocate across three main areas. We advocate for and support creative spaces, which are places in the community where people can go to make art. Those spaces are usually free or low cost, and some of them have a focus for particular communities such as mental health or disability communities or therapy, and others are available for anyone to join. We have a program with corrections to ensure that corrections facilities have arts programs and that incarceration people are benefiting from the arts as a rehabilitative tool. And we have the area that I work in, which is called the Arts for All program, supporting accessibility. Before I get into things too much, I just want to give a wee introduction to the language that we use at Arts Access. And we say deaf and disabled people, and we do that. We separate out deaf because not all deaf people in the deaf community identify as disabled, although some do, and of course some deaf people also have other disabilities. And we say disabled people quite intentionally because that's the language that's used in the New Zealand Disability Strategy and other high-level documents. So disabled people or people with disabilities, those words have rights and systems and communities associated with them. So we use those words for those reasons. And I'll just say now, keep an eye out for the poll popping up shortly. You can share where you feel your experience level is at when it comes to accessibility, and to access the poll, you can click on the triangle, circle, square logo, which is on the bottom right of your screen, and that poll will pop up there. So in this context, access is the ability for all people, regardless of disability or impairment, to be able to use a service or product, to participate in society and access our built environments and communities independently, with dignity and without restriction or barrier. And I think it's important to note that it is the right of deaf and disabled people to access arts, culture and heritage, and that right is protected by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And if you're interested in the particular article, the one that you're looking for is Article 30. And accessibility is important because deaf and disabled people need to be able to participate in society and in cultural experiences alongside their peers, their families and friends. And it's really important to be able to share those common experiences. And the arts are such a big part of how we connect with society, how we learn about the world around us, and how we learn about our history. So it's very, very important. Accessibility can look like many, many different things. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to assume that deaf or disabled people want a separate experience. And for some people, they may want that. They may want a private tour, but it's important that that's not considered the default for deaf and disabled people or deaf and disabled learners. And sometimes a separate experience is useful, but not always, and people shouldn't be separated from their peers and colleagues. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about good practice now. And access is most impactful when it's integrated and planned from the beginning of a process. And it may be that you're developing a new education program, or it may be that the space that you work in has a new exhibit, and those might be opportunities to consider accessibility in the program that you're delivering. So some types of accessibility require a bit more time or a bit more budget. So it's important to approach accessibility with intention and to work through it in a way that the result is going to be fit for purpose and it meets the needs of the people that are going to be utilising it. And it's also important to consult with deaf and disabled people in the design of accessibility, and to not make assumptions about what people might need. And if you're working with younger people, you may also be working with parents or whānau, or teachers and those in specialist services, depending on the context that you're working in. But there's a very common saying that some of you may have heard, nothing about us without us. And that's a bit of a rallying cry for deaf and disabled people who have fought for a very long time to be involved in the issues that impact them. And usually if you stick to that one, you won't go too far wrong. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of accessibility and the different things you can do. And there's going to be another poll popping up where you can share which types of accessibility you're most familiar with. So obviously one of the big parts of accessibility is the physical accessibility of the venue, the space that you're working in, your built environment. And that not only includes how someone gets into your space, whether there's accessible toilets and things like that, but it also includes exhibition design. For example, the height at which things are displayed or hung, and the height of interactive elements. So can someone in a wheelchair easily access those interactive buttons you've got in your exhibit, or can they see the picture hanging on the wall clearly? And if you're interested in some reading around that, there's a great resource by the Smithsonian Museum on exhibition design, and I think that one will be sent out along with this talk. Another big area of accessibility is sound and lighting. So in your museum, do you have the ability to turn off sounds that some people might find distressing if you're doing a quiet hour visit for people with autism or neurodiversity, or do you have the ability to turn up sound if you're doing a tour for people that are hard of hearing, for example? And lighting is really important for people who have low vision, but also for folks that may have mobility impairments. So, having the ability to adapt that to some extent is helpful, but also in terms of being able to describe what it's like ahead of time so that people are prepared for it. Wayfinding is really important. So how easy is it for someone to find their way through an exhibit or around the space that they're in? And also the transition between exhibits. So if you're, a big museum and you've got lots of interactive things going on, and one space might be quite loud and one space is really quiet, what is the experience like of moving between those spaces? Is there a place to stop and sit if someone needs to? Is there a quiet spot where they can just rest for a moment? Those kind of things can really have a big impact on how accessible a space feels for some people. And different sensory elements can be adapted to support the access for different communities. So, for example, if you were working with a group of young people who were coming in from a specialist school and lots of them had sensory sensitivity or were autistic, for example, you could run a low sensory hour where things were a bit quieter and a bit less overwhelming for them. And then there's things like audio description for blind and low vision people, and you may also have tactile elements that people could touch. You can have New Zealand Sign Language tours, or you could have videos in New Zealand Sign Language, like Te Papa have, where you have a QR code and someone can scan that with their phone and a video pops up in sign language explaining the exhibit. But equally around language, the style of writing is really important. Is any jargon explained? Is it clear and easy for someone who may not have a high level of reading and writing comprehension to understand? And if you're someone who's leading a group through a space, are you confident and comfortable to change the way that you're delivering information if someone's not quite understanding? So those are some of the different types of accessibility that you may be interested in working with, or you may already be working with. And social stories are becoming more common in the area of access for autistic and neurodiverse people, and their documents which explain to someone what's going to happen before they arrive, so they feel prepared and they know what to expect. But on that note, the more you can front load accessibility information so that people have access to the information before they come is really beneficial. And that might include things like where are the drop-off zones, are you able to store people's bags for them? Can they bring food and drink? All those kind of things that may help someone feel more comfortable coming into your space. And if you're working with class groups and things, you may find it beneficial to develop a bit of a guide for class groups coming into the space that incorporates accessibility information. And also providing a way for people to get in touch if they have questions. Some museums and galleries have access at email addresses. That's a really clear spot for people to be able to go, I have a question about wheelchair access. I can contact that email address and they'll let me know what the situation is. And on that note, it's really important to also include what is not accessible. And that way people can make an informed choice about what accessibility barriers they're willing to negotiate and which ones they're not. Awesome. So it's also really important to communicate rules clearly, particularly in museum or cultural spaces where you do have tactile elements where you can touch some things and not others. That can be confusing for some people to make sure that that kind of stuff is communicated clearly. And sensory maps are also really useful, and that's a map of your space that explains where loud and quiet areas are, where the exits are, where there's seating, anything that someone might need to know about being in the space. Can be very helpful, and there's some museums that have examples of those. I know City Gallery Wellington has one, Wellington Museum I think, and Auckland War Memorial Museum all have examples of sensory maps. Of course digital content is really important, so making sure that any digital content has captions, ideally audio description and sign language, but of course image descriptions and alt text for images too. So accessibility, all these things I've just mentioned, and I know there's a lot of them, and some of you will be at varying points of working in this area, in this space. It enables more people to engage broadly with your space, but you still may need to tailor situations to meet an individual's need or a particular group of people's needs, but accessibility will increase your ability to be able to do that and to do it with more ease and fluidity in your space. And a huge part of accessibility is feeling confident and comfortable to respond to deaf and disabled people and to adapt to meet their needs. And it's no good to have, you know, a really awesome accessible space if the people working in the space don't feel confident to make people feel welcome and to be able to support them. And so training around disability awareness and responsiveness can be really beneficial. If you know you've got a group of students coming in with learning disabilities, for example, or a group coming in from a specialist school, you know, talking with those teachers about what those students' needs are and making sure that you're feeling confident and comfortable for that to be a good experience for everyone. And often, you know, situations like this where you have groups coming in and they go really well and people really enjoy it, people are more likely to come back on their own later as well, which is really cool. It's also useful to know that some people's needs may change over the course of a visit. So someone might initially come in walking and feeling really good, and then, you know, over the course of the visit think, actually, I need to hire a wheelchair. And so, you know, being aware that, you know, disability doesn't always look like what we think it does, and not making assumptions about what someone's needs might be. And, you know, if you are doing accessibility programs, it's always really beneficial to get feedback and find out what is and isn't working or what you could do differently. And that means that you're continuing to evolve the service that you offer, and that deaf and disabled people are getting more out of their visit, which is awesome. So I'm going to talk a wee bit more about language now, particularly because language in the education space is sometimes a wee bit different to the language that deaf and disabled people, and particularly deaf and disabled adults, might use to describe themselves. But one thing I think is really important is don't be afraid to say disabled or disabled people. They're not bad words. Some individuals, of course, don't like them, and they may have language that they prefer to use themselves. And if that's the case, just model and use the language that they use. But when you're speaking broadly about the community, it's okay to say disabled people or people with disabilities. It's really important to try not to use euphemisms, things like differently abled or extra needs and things like that. They're really well-meaning terms. But they kind of come about because people unconsciously or consciously think that disability is a bad thing, and it's just a fact of natural human diversity, as some of us have disabilities, and euphemisms actually feel like they're further stigmatizing disability, and you're kind of reinforcing the idea that disability is a bad thing. So just being mindful of the language you use is really important. And we've got a resource at Arts Access called What Words to Use, which you might find helpful. But I was also talking to a friend recently in preparation for this talk, and who worked for the Ministry of Education, and they mentioned that the language being used in the education area has changed recently, and schools which used to be called special schools are now being called specialist schools. And what was called special needs or special education, the term that's being used now is students with disabilities and or learning support needs. So just being aware that sometimes the language that parents or caregivers or teachers and others working who are connected to the disability space may use language that is different than deaf or disabled people themselves use. So just being mindful and responsive to that and just reflecting the language that people use is a good idea. And, if you're ever unsure, looking at the guiding documents around disability in Aotearoa, the New Zealand Disability Strategy, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, those documents are useful guidelines, and also the disabled persons organisations which advocate for the rights of disabled people in New Zealand. And on that note, one community that has specific language that they prefer, the organisation People First advocates for people with learning disabilities, and they're quite clear that the community has told them that they prefer the language people with learning disabilities, as opposed to other disabled people might say disabled people. So it is a area that's always changing, and as communities become more connected, language evolves, which is very exciting. And so some general things to remember: develop access and partnership with disabled people, connect with disabled people and their representative organisations. If you're thinking about doing accessibility work, you can start, of course, by getting in touch with me at Arts Access, but also if you're wanting to work with a particular community, such as the deaf community or the blind low vision community, getting in touch with the organisations that advocate for and support those communities is really valuable. If you're in a situation where you're working directly with a disabled person and they have support workers, always remember to talk directly to the disabled person and not their support worker. Even if the support worker is answering on their behalf, still talk to the person themselves. And allow time for planning and implementing and getting feedback. And it's always useful to capture data if you can. And Arts Access Aotearoa can support by offering resources, connecting you with others doing similar work in similar areas, connecting you with service providers such as sign language interpreters, audio describers, advising on best practice. We also offer networking opportunities through the Arts for All network, which any museum culture organisation is welcome to join, regardless of if you have an arts focus or not. And we also do a lot of advocacy and policy work. So one of the things we try to encourage is for organisations doing accessibility work to develop a policy around that, so that the work is implemented in a strategic way across an organisation and is supported through an organisation, rather than by, sometimes we see passionate individuals really advocating for it in their space, but if they leave, then the work stops, and that kind of leaves the community in a bit of a sticky situation. So policies really benefit the development of accessibility, and we're available to support with that too. And to finish up, just some accessibility information around COVID, whether in person or online. The main thing is to acknowledge that COVID has impacted people's comfort levels around engaging in public spaces, and deaf and disabled people have been impacted through that in various ways, not necessarily because their disability makes them more vulnerable to COVID, but potentially because as health systems become overwhelmed or more people get sick, their support systems or support networks are impacted by that, so they may not have the ability to get out of their houses easily. And and things like that, but also being aware of mask exemption processes, and being able to communicate really clearly what your space is doing in that regard. And on a kind of practical level, thinking about if you have to restrict the number of people coming through your space, is there a way for people to just sit comfortably and wait, or could you notify them so that they can come back when, like sometimes when you go to a restaurant and it's really busy, they'll give you a number and you can come back, or they'll text you. Those kind of tools that mean that people aren't standing around waiting for a long time. Being aware that if someone is deaf, masks make communication really difficult. So, being prepared to having a notepad and pen available, or having an app on a tablet so that you can write messages backwards and forwards, and also knowing that if you can stay socially distanced, it's actually okay to take off your mask to communicate with a deaf person if they request that, and that mask exemption processes are changing. But at the moment, I believe it is still the case that you don't actually have to show an exemption card. The mask exemption is in the public health order. So the cards that people have were designed more as a communication tool, and not, they are not the exemption itself. So just being mindful of some of those things that also impact disabled people. And I know there's many people who have received so much flack for not wearing a mask that they're choosing not to go out and engage in public spaces. So being mindful of some of those things as well. Just, continuing to, include accessibility in your COVID responses. And I think I would just close by saying that some of this stuff, may not feel super closely aligned with your work in a particular education role, but accessibility doesn't really work in segments. Accessibility is developed and maintained across an organization, and all of the parts have to work together for accessibility to be a smooth process for people. And you and your roles are in a position to be able to advocate for accessibility and to be allies to the community. So anyone who is interested in knowing more or has questions, you're welcome to ask them shortly, but also, please feel welcome to reach out to me at Arts Access and get in touch. I'd love to have any conversations with you about accessibility and support if we can. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Stace. That was a really amazing talk. I've learned so much, and my head's kind of going, wow, there's so much that you've covered there that's really relevant to our sector. Thank you. I particularly appreciated the comments you made about, what's happening in the current COVID environment. And I think, it's quite easy to focus on the immediacy of the challenges of COVID and maybe not remember that we need to also think quite hard about accessibility at the same time. And thank you to Monica in the background, who's been putting all the links into all the resources that you've been mentioning throughout your talk. So if you're interested in any of those resources, you can click on the link in the chat, but we'll also be posting those links on our website when we upload the recording of this webinar. So if you want to go back and check on something that Stace has said, you can do that at a later date once that's posted online. So thank you very much. And it's lovely to see so many people in the call today. Well, I say see, I'm not actually seeing you because you've got your cameras turned off, but to know that there's so many people in the call today. And we also have Tara Fagan, the chair of Te Pūtiaki Manatanga, in the call today. So I'm omitted to acknowledge that. And welcome, Tara. Nice to have you here. If anyone's got a question for Stace, then the easiest way to pose your question is to write it in the chat, and we can pose it to Stace. But I can't see any questions at the moment, but I've got one. So I'm going to ask my question. So thinking about myself as an educator in the gallery, if I want to start providing an accessible learning program, and I haven't really tackled that in the past, what are your tips for where to start?
That's a really good question, and I think it will depend somewhat on the content of your your program and whether you're already working with school groups and working with certain age groups, or whether you're doing more like one-on-one visits and things like that. But if you are working with school groups, it's useful to get in touch with teachers working with students with disabilities, kind of finding out what information they would need, what's useful. I know some people have done really successful programs where they've gone into the school and talked to the students in a familiar environment before welcoming them into the gallery or museum. So really it's kind of that initial consultation of saying, you know, this is the service that we're able to offer, what would you like? How could we support? And then sort of trialing things and building from there would be my suggestion. Familiarizing yourself with concepts like plain English, potentially easy read, which is a particular format for working with people with learning disabilities. It's provided through People First, and they make it easy service. But generally, you know, working with teacher aides and specialists within school situations to start with, or going out to the community and, you know, inviting, you know, parents and children and families into spaces and kind of seeing how it goes and developing something from that. But generally, that consultation is really important.
Awesome, thank you. So we've had a couple of questions now in the chat. So I'll go to the first one. I'm sorry, I don't know your name because it's just a series of initials. Thank you to the person who posted that. They've said it's handy to have a standard pre-visit form that you can use to ask the class teacher if they have any students with disabilities. So I suppose that's exactly confirming what you've just said, is that it's good to get that communication going ahead of the visit, so you find yourself in a situation where you're prepared and you can plan.
So, for example, if you had a class coming in and you know that you had a student who was autistic or had sensory sensitivities and found, you know, busy environments really overwhelming, you might think about, do we have a quiet space that we can let them know is available, that if they need to take 5 or 10 minutes out to just self-regulate, that they can do that and it's available, and the teachers know that's available. You might think about letting them know that they're welcome to bring STEM toys or noise cancelling headphones, and, you know, let them know that the ways that they regulate themselves are welcome and supported. And being really clear about what rules are, what you can touch, what you can't, what behaviour expectations are, so that everyone's prepared before they get there and they're not in an unfamiliar environment and then trying to take that information in at the same time.
Great. So we've got another question from Josie from Putanga. She says, Kia ora, Stace, for those who work within a council structure, should your own facility, the actual gallery or museum, have its own accessibility policy as opposed to the general council policy? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can depend on a wee bit on the situation. I know some councils have a almost, I'm not sure what the exact word is, but like a collective of galleries or museums and kind of public spaces that are grouped together, and they might have an overarching policy, but generally a museum or a gallery would be doing specific work, and so you would want a specific policy to support that work, particularly if you were looking at an action plan around implementing certain types of access. You know, you might be looking at audio description and how you were going to develop capacity in-house for that, so you'd kind of be wanting to look at specific things. And I think particularly if you're wanting that policy to support, you know, developing a budget around accessibility, then you'd want that to be as focused on your organisation as it could be.
Yeah, good point about the budget, because I think that may be something that, you know, can hold some people back in this area of work. Mel has asked that she's curious to know about how to select the right kind of objects for a sensory tour or a sensory experience, and are there any supporting resources that need to be wrapped around that?
Yeah, I know there's going to be another talk in this series that will look more closely at audio description and touch tours and things like that, but generally it's thinking about what is meaningful, like what gives extra context to what the work is that you're showing. If it helps describe the way it's made, or offering another sensory experience, so perhaps it's what something smells like, or perhaps it's a replica of a tool, or a replica of like a bird or something like that, but something that gives people a sense of what you're talking about and extra information. So you're not just saying, here's some canvas because that's what the painting is painted on for the sake of it, but it actually provides extra information for people. There are some resources out there around this. There's one on the Arts Access website called Making Sense of Sensory Tours with Judith Jones, who is a host at Te Papa, who runs sensory tours there, which explains some of her work in that area that may be useful, and there's some great international examples too.
Awesome, thank you. So I can't see any more in the chat, but I've got another question for you. So you've talked a lot about talking to schools ahead of time, and we've talked about maybe sending schools a form where they can fill out information. But let's just say that a school group arrives and we haven't had, for whatever reason, we haven't had a conversation ahead of time with the teacher, and we're surprised, and a student arrives with a disability. Have you got any tips or advice for how to deal with that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that just because someone has a disability, it's not necessarily going to be a thing that you need to do anything about. Lots of people have disabilities that they're just really comfortable navigating themselves. They know what they need. They might be familiar with your space already, and they haven't said anything because they didn't feel like it was necessary. And sometimes it may have been overlooked, and it might just be a moment of waiting for an opportunity to just quickly check in with that person or a teacher and say, hey, is there anything we can do to support you today? Is there anything you need from us? And that's, I think, where having some disability responsiveness training can be really useful. So you feel a bit, even though that situation might be a surprise, you've got that kind of training and context to lean back on and go, oh, yeah, that's right, that's what this is all good. And I think on that note, just if someone says they don't need support or they don't need help, just go, okay, cool, that's awesome, have a great visit, and let us know if you need anything further, and just kind of really respect that someone's acknowledged that you're available to help, but they don't need it right now. Often disabled people experience people being quite forceful about their desire to help, and it does the opposite. So yeah, just being mindful of that.
Monica's just popped in a question that relates to that, and asking if there's anybody at Arts Access Aotearoa who provides disability responsiveness training.
We don't currently offer training as such. I do a lot of one-on-one work with people, so someone would get in touch with me and say, hey, can we have a chat about this particular thing? And I would talk them through the process. There are a few different organisations that do disability responsiveness training in different areas. One of them is CCS Disability Action, that does a great disability responsiveness training. B-Lab also does. And then there are others that do trainings around physical access and things like that, or accessibility audits. So if anyone's interested in that area, get in touch and I can connect you. There's also more disability specific trainings available. Deaf Aotearoa does deaf responsiveness work, and blind low vision also offers trainings. People First around learning disability, etc. So it really depends what you're interested in.
Great, that's good to know that there's so many resources out there, and we'll post those links on. Okay, so there aren't any other questions that I can see. I've got one last question for you. So from your perspective, working with as an advocate and advisor and specialist within this sector, what one change would you like to see in our sector? If we all take something away from this and choose to make some action in some areas to make an improvement, what would you love to see?
I think I would love to see a really strategic and really intentional approach to this work. There is so much good work happening, and often what I see is it's driven by one or two passionate people, and I just really would love to see it kind of acknowledged as a really important aspect of galleries and museums, is that everyone has the right to access them, and that accessibility given, you know, that weight in budgets and in planning and in you know, the public programs and just the general approach across a space. And, you know, acknowledging that sometimes it's slow work and it does take time, and building relationships with community takes time, but just seeing that commitment would be really incredible.
Well, that's a good challenge for all of us to bear in mind after this webinar. Oh, we've just got one last question that's popped up from Claire, who says, we recently had an external agency come and deliver an accessibility workshop. And they included parents with pushchairs under the umbrella of accessibility. What's your opinion on this? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so it depends which approach you're taking. And B-Lab work from a broader approach than just disability. They tend to talk about access needs, and they're working to more of a universal design kind of framework where accessibility benefits everyone, and accessibility in the context that they're working in does include anyone who is experiencing barriers through services not being designed to consider their needs. So, you know, if a space only has stairs, then that's really difficult for people who also are using pushchairs. You know, for example, buses and, you know, shared spaces in public. You know, if you think of those shared footpaths and roads and things, they're kind of working in that context, which is brilliant. And I think it does benefit everyone to think in that way. You know, I often think of a cartoon by an English disabled person whose cartoonist handle is Crippen. And there's a cartoon he, I think, drew as a child in a wheelchair waiting to get into a school on a snow day, and he's saying to the caretaker, can you just clear the ramp? And the caretaker's saying, yeah, just hang on a second, I'll clear the stairs and let these students in, and then I'll get to you. And it's kind of that idea that the stairs are the norm, rather than if you cleared the ramp, everyone could use the stairs, but not everyone could use the ramp, but not everyone can use the stairs. So it's sort of thinking about that approach of what works for everyone, which is not necessarily what we always prioritize. I do think politically, as a disabled person, this is just my personal perspective, that it's useful to be aware of sometimes people who have had disabilities their whole lives or have acquired injuries are dealing with barriers on a different level than someone who may be using a pushchair for 2 or 3 years while their child goes from being a baby to walking independently, or someone who has a broken leg. Their access is still really important, but just being aware of the discrimination and systemic barriers that sit alongside someone who is deaf or has a disability is a wee bit different. But generally speaking, access should work for everyone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that answer. Wow, I think unless there's any more questions that pop up in the next couple of seconds, we can draw those questions to a close. Thank you for all your answers, and thank you for your really insightful talk today. It's been really interesting, and it was really interesting to see people's contributions to the polls as well, and to understand a bit more about where our sector is at in terms of levels of confidence or awareness, or where we are at with this work. So before I close with karakia, I just need to let everybody know what webinar is coming up next. So we're taking a bit of a break from our webinar schedule over the Easter period, as I know that a lot of you will be taking holidays. So our next one is on the 5th of May, on a Thursday, again at the same time, 3:30 to 4:30. And following on from Stace, we'll be looking at accessibility again, and we'll be talking to members of staff at the Auckland Museum who are going to share their experiences with accessibility, and including the creation of a series of sensory maps for visitors. So that should be really good. We've also got another couple of webinars which relate to accessibility work coming up a bit later, and we'll let you know a bit more about those a bit nearer the time. So thank you to both of our sign language interpreters today. It was really great having you in the webinar and really nice to meet you. Thank you. And thank you, Stace. So yeah, we'll close with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia kuti uru tapunui. Kia wātia, kia mama, ti nākau, ti tinana, te wairua I te arotakatā. Koia rā, whakairerea ake ki runga. Kia tina, tina, hui e, taikie. Thank you, everybody. Mātiwa. Thank you for coming.